Picture a man in field gray standing in a trench that smells like cordite and rot. He carries no rifle, no bayonet, just a crucifix and a leather case with communion wafers already turning soft from the damp. He is a Feldgeistlicher, a German field chaplain, and in 1914, when the armies marched, about 1,000 of these men followed, Protestant pastors, Catholic priests, some rabbis. They believed they would comfort soldiers in a clean war that would end by Christmas. By 1916, the mud at Verdun told them otherwise. By 1918, they faced accusations that would haunt them for decades. Coward, propagandist, absent when it mattered. But what was life really like for these men who wore the cross instead of the sword? What did they see when soldiers were dying faster than they could administer last rites? You are 28. You have studied theology for 7 years. You have never seen a man with his jaw torn off. But on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, and by August 4th, Germany is at war with France, Britain, and Russia. The military needs chaplains. You are assigned to a division. You do not know that this division will see Verdun. You do not know about the Somme. You pack your field altar, your stole, your communion kit. You board a train heading west. The soldiers on the train are singing. They think they will be in Paris by September. You think you will help them prepare their souls for a righteous cause. 1 month later, the singing stops. The Western Front is a 400-mile scar from the North Sea to Switzerland. And you realize that everything you learned in seminary is useless. If you value documented military and religious history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual, using sources from the Encyclopedia of World War I, published by Freie Universität Berlin in 2024, and Church History Journal from Cambridge University Press, published in 2001. These are peer-reviewed academic sources that draw on German military archives and chaplain reports held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Now back to the information. The structure is simple. Each German division gets one chaplain, sometimes two if the division is large. Catholic soldiers get a Catholic priest. Protestant soldiers get a Protestant pastor. Jewish soldiers, if they are lucky, might share a rabbi across multiple units. The chaplain holds the rank of an officer but wears no sidearms, just a uniform with a cross on the collar. The plan looks clean on paper. One chaplain per division means roughly one priest for every 10,000 to 15,000 men. In Bavaria, which is 70% Catholic, the numbers get worse. From 1915 to 1917, Kriegstage, the Bavarian contingent in the Imperial German Army grows from 380,000 soldiers to 530,000. The number of Catholic chaplains increases from 170 to 189. 19 more priests for 150,000 more men. That means one chaplain is now responsible for roughly 1,600 Catholic soldiers. Before the war, a Bavarian parish priest ministered to about 665 people. Now you're trying to provide pastoral care to more than double that number. And they are scattered across miles of trenches, field hospitals, and burial grounds. And they are dying at industrial speed. Your division is moving to the Somme. It is July 1916. British artillery has been shelling German positions for 7 days straight. 1,400,000 shells. When the barrage lifts on July 1st, the British Fourth Army goes over the top. By the end of the first day, the British suffer 57,470 casualties, 19,240 dead. The German Second Army holds most of its line, but units on your sector take heavy losses. You spend the day at the battalion aid station. It is a dugout reinforced with timber and sandbags. Wounded men arrive on stretchers. Some are unconscious, some are screaming. Some are silent in the way that means they will not make it through the night. You move from man to man. Catholic soldiers want confession. You hear it quickly. There's no time for the ritual. You say the words of absolution. You make the sign of the cross. You move to the next man. Protestant soldiers want a prayer. You give them that. Jewish soldiers sometimes ask if you can find a rabbi. You cannot. You tell them God hears all prayers. You do not know if they believe you. You do not know if you believe yourself. By the end of the day, you have given last rites to 40 men. You have prayed over 60 more. You have not eaten. You have not slept. The shelling starts again after dark. You curl up in the corner of the dugout and try to rest. You cannot. The sounds are too loud. The smell of blood is too thick. The Somme lasts until November. German forces suffer roughly 500,000 casualties. The French and British combined lose over 600,000. Your division rotates through the sector 3 times. Each time, you lose men you knew by name. Private Weber, who asked you about his wife's pregnancy. Corporal Miller, who carried your field altar when you held mass in a ruined farmhouse. Lieutenant Braun, who told you he stopped believing in God in 1915, but still came to your services because the hymns reminded him of his mother. You bury them in mass graves because there is no time for individual burials. You say the prayers quickly. German regulations state that chaplains are responsible for the spiritual care of the troops and for burying the dead. But when the dead number in the thousands, the prayers become shorter, the rituals become abbreviated. You tell yourself you're doing the best you can, but at night, when you are alone, you wonder if God is listening to prayers said over graves, dug by exhausted men who no longer remember the names of the bodies they are covering with dirt. February 1917. Your division is sent to Verdun. The battle began in February 1916. It is now 1 year later, and the fighting has not stopped. The French and Germans have turned this sector into a meat grinder. Estimates say the French suffered around 377,000 casualties, the Germans around 337,000. The numbers are contested. Some historians say they are higher, some say lower. What is not contested is the density of death. In some areas, there are so many bodies that soldiers walk on corpses because the ground is no longer visible. You are stationed at a dressing station behind the front. Wounded arrive constantly. Mustard gas cases, shrapnel wounds, men with limbs gone, men with faces gone. You do what you can. You give communion. You hear confessions. You write letters to families. Dear Frau Schmidt, your husband Friedrich was wounded on March 3rd. He received the sacraments. He died peacefully. You are lying. Friedrich did not die peacefully. Friedrich choked on his own blood while you tried to give him last rites, but you cannot write that to his wife. You cannot tell her that her husband's last words were a scream, so you lie. You tell yourself it is a mercy. You're not the only one lying. The chaplains at the front are not telling the soldiers the whole truth either. Back home, the church leadership issues directives. The chaplains must emphasize victory. They must maintain morale. They must tell the soldiers that God is with Germany. Court chaplain Ernst von Driehander preached in the Reichstag on August 4th, 1914. He declared that Germany was going into battle for culture against barbarism, for civilization against the instincts of the undisciplined masses. The Protestant clergy draws on the wars of liberation in 1813 and the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 to 1871. They argue that the Great War is another stage in the unfolding German national spirit. The sermons are stirring. They are patriotic. They are effective at mobilizing the home front. But at the Somme and Verdun, the soldiers are not interested in sermons about German destiny. They want to know if God still hears them when they are standing in a trench filled with 3 feet of freezing water. They want to know if there is any meaning in watching their friends die for a few hundred yards of mud. And you, the chaplain, are supposed to give them an answer. But you do not have one. You stopped having answers in 1915. The criticisms start during the war and intensify after. German military chaplains are charged with lacking courage. They are accused of staying behind the lines while soldiers fight and die. They are accused of overemphasizing victory in their sermons, instead of addressing the themes of death and redemption that soldiers actually need. Historian Benjamin Zeman, who has studied German chaplains extensively, notes that the historical record is more nuanced than these accusations suggest. Chaplains faced immense practical challenges. They were assigned to division level 2s, which meant they were responsible for units spread across miles of front. They could not be everywhere at once. When a division attacked, the chaplain typically remained at the aid station because regulations prohibited them from advancing with assault troops. This was not cowardice. This was military policy. Chaplains were non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. They wore Red Cross brassards. They carried no weapons, except, in some cases, a pistol for self-defense in enemy territory. If they were captured, they were supposed to be treated as medical personnel. In practice, this meant that chaplains spent most of their time at battalion aid stations and field hospitals, where they could provide pastoral care to the wounded and dying. It also meant that soldiers in the frontline trenches often went weeks without seeing a chaplain. The gap between expectation and reality creates resentment. Soldiers write letters home. They say the chaplain never comes to the front. They say the chaplain only appears when it is safe. But the chaplain is following orders. Military regulations from 1914 through 1918 explicitly state that chaplains are to remain at advanced dressing stations unless specifically ordered forward by a senior chaplain or commanding officer. Some chaplains ignore these orders. They move forward during attacks to give last rites to the dying. Some are killed doing this, but most follow regulations, and when the war ends in November 1918, the accusations follow them home. The soldiers who survive do not remember the chaplains at the aid stations. They remember the chaplains who were not in the trenches when they needed them. The families of the dead do not remember the letters the chaplains wrote. They remember that their sons died alone. The Spanish flu arrives in 1918. It kills more people than the war. Your division is hit hard. Men who survived 4 years of combat die in field hospitals from a virus. You move through the wards. You give last rites to men who are 20 years old. You write more letters. Dear Frau Bauer, your son Karl died of influenza on October 8th. He was brave until the end. You are lying again. Karl was delirious with fever. He did not know where he was. He called for his mother. You held his hand until he stopped breathing. You told him his mother was there. You told him he was home. It was the kindest lie you could give him. November 11th, 1918. The armistice is signed. The war is over. Germany has mobilized 11 million men. Approximately 2 million are dead. Roughly 15% of those who served. For men born between 1880 and 1899, the death rate is 13%. Your division returns to Germany. You return to your parish. You try to resume your duties. You cannot. Everything feels hollow. The sermons you preached about God and victory ring false now that Germany is lost. The soldiers who survived come to you for counsel. They ask why God allowed the war. They ask why their friends died. They ask if there is any meaning in the suffering. You do not have answers. You tell them that God's ways are mysterious. You tell them that their sacrifice was not in vain. You're lying again. You do not believe these things anymore. You stop believing them at Verdun. The accusations intensify in the 1920s and 30s. Books are published criticizing the German military chaplaincy. The Church in the Furnace, published in 1918, becomes part of a genre. Chaplains themselves write many of these critiques. They admit they failed. They admit they preached propaganda instead of truth. They admit they stayed safe while soldiers died. But some chaplains defend their service. They point out the impossible conditions. They point out the numbers. One chaplain for 1,600 men. One priest trying to provide pastoral care across miles of trenches. One man expected to hold mass, hear confessions, write letters, bury the dead, counsel the traumatized, and maintain morale. All while shells are falling. All while men are dying faster than he can administer sacraments. The defense does not resonate. The public wants someone to blame for the war. The chaplains are easy targets. They wore uniforms but carried no weapons. They preached about God's will but stayed behind the lines. They promised victory but delivered defeat. The legacy of the World War I chaplaincy haunts the German church. When World War II begins in 1939, approximately 1,000 Christian chaplains serve the Wehrmacht. They are older than the World War I chaplains. Military regulations require them to be born in 1909 or earlier. They are in their 40s and 50s. The intention is to avoid wasting prime fighting power. Younger pastors are drafted into regular combat units. Catholic priests below the designated age serve in medical corps. The World War II chaplains learn from World War I. They are told not to preach cheap patriotism. They are told not to repeat the sermons about German destiny. A Protestant chaplain with the 7th Armored Division in the Soviet Union in December 1941 writes that recent events show God is warning Germany not to become arrogant. He says, the war will not be won by printer's ink, but by blood. This is a direct rebuke of the World War I chaplaincy's propaganda. But the World War II chaplains face the same structural problems. They are still assigned at division level. They are still responsible for thousands of men. They are still expected to provide pastoral care in impossible conditions. And they are still accused of failing to do enough. The question remains, what could a chaplain actually do? You are standing at a battalion aid station in 1916. It is after the Battle of the Somme. Wounded men fill every available space. Some are on stretchers, some are on the ground, some are leaning against the walls because there is nowhere else to put them. A soldier calls for you. He is 19 years old. His name is Hans. He has a gut wound. He knows he is dying. He wants confession. You kneel next to him. You hear his confession. He tells you he is afraid. He tells you he does not want to die. He asks if God will forgive him for killing men. You tell him yes. You give him absolution. You place a communion wafer on his tongue. He dies 10 minutes later. You move to the next soldier. His name is Friedrich. He is 23. He has lost both legs. He is conscious. He is screaming. You try to pray with him. He tells you to leave. He says if God exists, he would not allow this. You stay anyway. You hold his hand. You do not pray. You just sit with him until the morphine takes effect. You move to the next soldier. You do not remember his name. You stopped remembering names in 1915. There are too many. You give him last rites. You move to the next, and the next, and the next. By the time you finish, it is dawn. You have been working for 18 hours. You have given last rites to 60 men. You have prayed with 100 more. You have not saved anyone. You have only helped them die. Is that enough? The soldiers who lived say no. They say you should have been in the trenches. They say you should have shared their danger. But if you had been in the trenches, you would not have been at the aid station. And the men dying at the aid station needed you more than the men in the trenches. The regulations recognize this. The military command recognizes this, but the soldiers do not. And when the war ends, the soldiers are the ones who write the history. The chaplains are remembered as cowards. The chaplains are remembered as propagandists. The chaplains are remembered as men who preached about sacrifice but never made any themselves. This narrative is not entirely fair, but it is not entirely false either. The propaganda was real. Protestant chaplains in particular preached sermons about German superiority and divine favor. Court chaplain Ernst von Dryender's sermon on August 4th, 1914 set the tone. He said Germany was defending civilization against barbarism. He said God would bless German weapons. Other chaplains echoed this message. They told soldiers that dying for the fatherland was the highest honor. They told families that their sons' deaths had meaning in the grand narrative of German destiny. This message was effective in 1914 and 1915. It helped mobilize the population. It helped maintain morale. But by 1916, when the casualties mounted and victory seemed impossible, the message rang hollow. Soldiers stopped believing that God favored Germany. They stopped believing their deaths had meaning, and they blamed the chaplains for lying to them. The chaplains, in turn, faced a dilemma. If they told the truth, if they admitted that the war seemed pointless and the suffering meaningless, they would demoralize the troops. They would be accused of defeatism. They could be court-martialed. So they kept preaching. They kept lying. And they hated themselves for it. Catholic chaplains faced slightly different pressures. The Catholic Church maintained a more universal message. Pope Benedict XV issued a peace note in August 1917 calling for an end to the war. He described the conflict as a useless massacre. German Catholic chaplains were caught between loyalty to the Vatican and loyalty to the German state. In heavily Catholic Bavaria, Bishop Michael von Faulhaber told chaplains in April 1916 that their most important duty was countering disaffection with the war. Not pastoral care, not spiritual guidance, countering disaffection. This directive came from a church leader who was supposed to prioritize souls over politics. But the war blurred those lines. Church and state were intertwined. Chaplains who preached peace were seen as traitors. Chaplains who preached victory were seen as propagandists. There was no safe position, so most chaplains navigated a middle path. They preached about duty and sacrifice without explicitly endorsing the war's goals. They provided comfort to the dying without questioning why so many were dying. They wrote letters to families that emphasized the heroism of the dead without mentioning the horror of their deaths. And they told themselves they were doing the best they could in an impossible situation. The shortage of chaplains made everything worse. From 1915 to 1917 in Bavaria alone, the ratio went from 1 chaplain per 2,235 Catholic soldiers to 1 per 2,804. Across the entire German Imperial Army, the situation was similar. Protestant chaplains were also spread thin. Jewish chaplains were even rarer. The German military had a handful of rabbis serving as chaplains, but they were assigned at corps level or higher, meaning they were responsible for tens of thousands of men across multiple divisions. A Jewish soldier in the trenches might go months without seeing a rabbi. When Rabbi Dr. Aaron Tenzer served as a field chaplain, he wore the Iron Cross ribbon and a Red Cross brassard to show he was a non-combatant. He tried to reach Jewish soldiers across multiple units. But there were too many soldiers and too few rabbis. Jewish soldiers often relied on Christian chaplains for pastoral care. Some Christian chaplains were willing to pray with Jewish soldiers. Some were not. The experience varied by division and by chaplain. But the structural problem remained. There were not enough chaplains of any faith to meet the need. The war changes you. By 1917, you no longer look like the man who boarded the train in August 1914. You are thinner. Your uniform hangs loose. Your face is gaunt. You have not slept well in 3 years. When you close your eyes, you see the faces of the dead. Private Weber, Corporal Miller, Lieutenant Brown, Hans, Friedrich, the soldier whose name you cannot remember. They come to you in dreams. They ask why you let them die. You tell them you did your best. They do not believe you. You do not believe yourself. In January 1918, you write a letter to your bishop. You tell him you can no longer serve as a chaplain. You tell him you have lost your faith. He writes back. He says you are suffering from battle fatigue. He says you must persevere. He says the soldiers need you. You do not respond. You stay at your post. You keep giving last rites. You keep writing letters to families. You keep lying, because that is what you are trained to do. That is what the military expects. That is what God, if he exists, apparently wants. The armistice comes. You go home. You try to resume your old life. You cannot. The parish feels foreign. The people feel distant. They did not see what you saw. They did not smell what you smelled. They did not hold the hands of dying boys who called for their mothers. They thank you for your service. They tell you you did God's work. You nod. You smile. You do not correct them. Because what would you say? That you failed? That you lied? That you watched thousands of men die and could do nothing to stop it? They would not understand. They would tell you that you did your best. They would tell you that God has a plan. They would tell you the same things you told the soldiers. And you would know they were lying. Just as you were lying. Just as everyone has been lying since August 1914. The criticisms hurt because they are partially true. You were not in the trenches. You did overemphasize victory in your sermons. You did fail to provide adequate pastoral care to thousands of soldiers who needed it. But the criticisms also ignore the reality. You were one man trying to care for 1,600 soldiers. You were prohibited by military regulations from advancing with assault troops. You were expected to maintain morale while also providing honest spiritual guidance. And these two goals were fundamentally incompatible. You were ordered to preach victory while watching defeat unfold in real time. You were told to give soldiers hope while bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. And when the war ended and Germany lost, you were blamed for not doing enough. You were blamed for doing too much. You were blamed for existing in a role that was structurally impossible from the start. Historian Benjamin Zeman, who has extensively studied German chaplains in World War I, offers a more nuanced picture. His research, which draws on chaplain reports and soldier testimonies from German military archives, shows that chaplains faced immense practical challenges. The criticisms of chaplains for not being at the front line ignore military regulations that explicitly placed them at aid stations. The accusations of propaganda ignore the directives from church and military leadership that required chaplains to maintain morale. The claims that chaplains were cowards ignore the conditions at battalion aid stations, where chaplains worked under shell fire while tending to hundreds of wounded men. Zeman's work, published in multiple academic journals between 2001 and 2013, demonstrates that the narrative of chaplain failure is more complicated than the popular memory suggests. But nuance does not change public perception. The soldiers who survived believed the chaplains failed them, and in a sense, they were right, not because the chaplains were cowards, but because the chaplaincy system itself was designed for a different kind of war. It was designed for battles where casualties were measured in dozens, not thousands. It was designed for conflicts where chaplains could move freely between units without crossing miles of shelled terrain. It was designed for a world where faith could provide clear answers to moral questions. World War I was not that world, and the chaplains paid the price. After the war, some chaplains leave the ministry. They cannot reconcile what they saw with what they believe. They cannot stand in a pulpit and preach about a loving God when they remember the screams of men dying from mustard gas. Other chaplains stay. They try to rebuild. They try to help their congregations make sense of the war. They fail. Germany is broken. The economy is collapsing. The political system is fragmenting. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, places the blame for the war on Germany and demands massive reparations. The German people feel betrayed. They look for scapegoats, Jews, communists, the politicians who signed the armistice, and the chaplains who told them God was on their side. The chaplains become symbols of the broader failure. They represent the church's complicity in the war. They represent the lies told to mobilize the population. They represent the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. And when the Nazis rise to power in the 1930s, they exploit this resentment. They promise to restore German honor. They promise to avenge the humiliation of Versailles, and some former chaplains, desperate to find meaning in the suffering, believe them. They put on the uniform again. They preach for a new cause. They make the same mistakes all over again. The question lingers, what was the right thing to do? If you are a chaplain in 1916, standing at a battalion aid station with 60 dying men and no medical supplies, what do? Do you tell them the truth? That their deaths are pointless? That the war is unwinnable? That God, if he exists, has abandoned them? Or do you lie? Do you tell them their sacrifice matters? That God is with them? That their deaths serve a higher purpose? The honest answer is cruel. The comforting lie is a betrayal. And you, the chaplain, must choose every day, every hour. With every dying soldier, no matter what you choose, someone will say you were wrong. The soldiers will say you lied. The church will say you did your duty. Your conscience will say you failed, and all three will be right. In 2004, historian Doris Bergen published research on German military chaplains that examines this question across 2 world wars. Her work, which has been funded by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the German Marshall Fund, shows that chaplains in both world wars faced similar structural problems. They were expected to serve 2 masters, God and the state. They were expected to provide honest spiritual guidance while also maintaining military morale. They were expected to comfort the dying while also justifying the killing. These expectations were contradictory. They could not be reconciled. And the chaplains who tried to navigate this contradiction were crushed by it. Bergen's research, which draws on chaplain memoirs, military reports, and soldier testimonies, demonstrates that the chaplaincy system was fundamentally flawed, not because the individual chaplains were bad men, but because the role itself was designed to serve political purposes that conflicted with genuine pastoral care. The chaplains were tools of the state, and when the state failed, the chaplains were blamed for that failure. The final verdict is complicated. German field chaplains in World War I did the best they could in an impossible situation. They were undermanned. They were overwhelmed. They were following military regulations that kept them away from the front lines. They were following church directives that required them to preach morale-boosting messages. And they were watching thousands of men die while being unable to provide adequate spiritual care. The criticisms of the chaplains are not entirely unfair. They did preach propaganda. They did stay behind the lines while soldiers fought. They did fail to provide the pastoral care that soldiers needed. But the criticisms also ignore the structural problems. One chaplain per 1,600 soldiers is not enough. One priest trying to cover miles of front is not enough. One man expected to maintain morale, provide sacraments, bury the dead, write letters to families, and offer spiritual guidance is not enough. The system was designed to fail, and the chaplains, through no fault of their own, became the symbols of that failure. In the Bavarian military archives in Munich, there are records of chaplain reports from 1916 and 1917. They document the daily activities of Catholic chaplains serving with Bavarian divisions, mass attendance, confessions heard, last rites administered, letters written, burials performed. The numbers are staggering. One chaplain reports hearing 300 confessions in a single week before a major offensive. Another reports performing 60 burial services in 3 days after a failed attack. A third reports spending 18 hours straight at an aid station during a gas attack, moving from soldier to soldier, giving last rites until he collapses from exhaustion. These reports do not mention morale. They do not mention propaganda. They do not mention sermons about German destiny. They only mention the work, the endless, grinding work of trying to provide spiritual care to men who are dying faster than one man can possibly reach them. This is the reality of the German field chaplaincy in World War I. Not cowardice, not propaganda, just exhaustion and failure in the face of industrial-scale death. If you value documented research and factual history like this, subscribe. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script draws from the Encyclopedia of World War I. Specifically, the article on churches by Patrick Houlihan, published October 9th, 2024, which cites chaplain-to-soldier ratios and parish comparisons from Bavarian military records. It also uses research by Benjamin Zeman from the University of Sheffield, whose work on German military chaplains and rural soldiers draws on archival materials from the Bavarian State Archives. Now back to the information. The story does not end in November 1918. The chaplains who survive carry the weight of the war for the rest of their lives. Some return to their parishes and never speak of what they saw. Some write memoirs, trying to make sense of the experience. Some leave the ministry entirely, unable to reconcile faith with what they witnessed. And some, when the Second World War begins, in 1939, put the uniform on again. They tell themselves this time will be different. They tell themselves they have learned from the mistakes of the First War. They are wrong. The Second World War chaplains face the same problems: insufficient numbers, impossible expectations, the gap between what soldiers need and what one man can provide. And when that war ends in 1945, the accusations return. The chaplains are blamed again. They are blamed for serving a genocidal regime. They are blamed for not speaking out against atrocities. They are blamed for existing in a role that requires them to serve the state while claiming to serve God. And the chaplains, once again, have no good answer. Because there is no good answer. There's only the reality of trying to do an impossible job in the middle of hell. The final question is not whether the German field chaplains succeeded or failed. They failed. The evidence is clear. They could not provide adequate pastoral care to the number of soldiers they were assigned. They could not be everywhere they were needed. They could not give honest spiritual guidance while also maintaining morale. The system ensured their failure. The question is whether any human being could have succeeded in that role, and the answer is no. One man cannot provide spiritual care to 1,600 soldiers spread across miles of trenches. One priest cannot hear confessions, administer last rites, conduct burials, write letters to families, maintain morale, and preserve his own sanity while shells are falling and men are dying by the thousands. It is not possible. It has never been possible. The German military knew this, the church knew this, They sent the chaplains anyway, and when the chaplains could not perform miracles, they were blamed for failing to do the impossible. In the archives at Freiburg, there is a chaplain report from October 1918. It is 3 pages long. It is written by a Catholic priest assigned to a division that fought at Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele. The report is matter of fact. It lists numbers, masses conducted, confessions heard, last rites administered, burials performed. Then, at the bottom of the 3rd page, there is a handwritten note. It says, "I have done my best. It is not enough. It will never be enough. May God forgive me." That note captures the reality of the German field chaplaincy in World War I. Not cowardice, not propaganda, just a man trying to do an impossible job and failing, just a priest watching thousands of men die and being unable to save them, just a human being confronted with industrial-scale death and realizing that faith alone cannot stop it. That is what life was really like for German field chaplains in World War I, and that is why, when the war ended, they were remembered not for what they did, but for what they could not do. The final image, November 11, 1918, 11 a.m. The guns fall silent. After 4 years, 1,568 days of fighting, the Western Front goes quiet. You are standing at a battalion aid station in France. The wounded are still arriving, men who were hit by shells in the final hours of the war. The fighting has stopped, but the dying continues. You move from man to man, you give last rites, you pray, you hold hands, you do the work you have been doing since August 1914. Nothing has changed, except now, when you tell the dying men that their sacrifice mattered, you know it is a lie. Germany has lost. The men died for nothing. 2 million German soldiers are dead, 8 million worldwide, and you, the chaplain, are supposed to make sense of it. You're supposed to find meaning in the carnage. You're supposed to tell the families that God had a plan, but you have no answer. You have no meaning. You have only the memory of thousands of faces. Private Weber, Corporal Müller, Lieutenant Braun, Hans, Friedrich, the soldier whose name you cannot remember. They are all dead, and you are alive, and you will carry the weight of their deaths for the rest of your life. That is the legacy of the German field chaplaincy in World War I. Not failure to serve, but the impossibility of the service itself.